For centuries, boys were top of the class. But these days, that's no longer the case. A new study by the OECD, a club of mostly rich countries, examined how 15-year-old boys and girls performed at reading, mathematics, and science. Boys still score somewhat better at maths, and in science the genders are roughly equal. But when it comes to the students who really struggle, the difference is stark. Boys are 50% more likely than girls to fall short of basic standards in all three areas. Researchers suggest that doing homework set by teachers is linked to better performance in maths, reading, and science. Boys, it appears, spend more of their free time in the virtual world. They are 17% more likely than girls to play collaborative online games than girls every day. They also use the internet more. Third, peer pressure plays a role. A lot of boys decide early on that they are just too cool for school, which means they're more likely to be rowdy in class. Teachers mark them down for this. In anonymous tests, boys perform better. In fact, the gender gap in reading drops by a third when teachers don't know the gender of the pupil they are marking. So what can be done to close this gap? Getting boys to do more homework and cut down on screen time would help. But most of all, abandoning gender stereotypes would benefit all students.
The history of software is of course very new. And the whole IT industry is really only 67 years old, which is extraordinary, and to be so close to the birth of a major new technology, a major new discipline, is quite remarkable given where we got to in those 67 years. And the progression has been not so much a progression as a stampede, because Moore's law, the rapid expansion in the power of computing and the rapid fall of the cost of computing and storage and communications has made it feasible for information technology to move into all sorts of areas of life that were never originally envisaged. What has happened is that there has been, as I said, a stampede for people to pick the low-hanging fruit. And that is what's guided the development of software and information technology over the past decades, and continues to do so, with a number of consequences that we will explore.
To be a successful entrepreneur, you should have good ideas, but the definition of a good idea varies depending on whom you ask. A great idea should have several features. Firstly, the great idea should be various and novel. Secondly, the great idea should be unique, which means no one has thought about it. Thirdly, it is essential for great ideas to be transformative and productive. All ideas are essentially a combination of other smaller ideas, but this doesn't mean they can't be unique. Merely copying doesn't make anything idiosyncratic, it's the individuality that one puts in which makes a concept stand out. Constant innovation leaves no room for stagnation and thus, adds on to the basic idea, effectively making it unique. Unique ideas are inspired by basic things, they are simply extensions of pre-existing notions. And, an idea or a concept is unique only when it transcends its predecessor and serves its purpose in a better and more precise way. A leader can define or clarify goals by issuing a memo or an executive order, an edict or a fatwa or a tweet, by passing a law, barking a command, or presenting an interesting idea in a meeting of colleagues. Leaders can mobilize people's energies in ways that range from subtle, quiet persuasion to the coercive threat or the use of deadly force. Sometimes a charismatic leader such as Martin Luther King Jr. can define goals and mobilize energies through rhetoric and the power of example. We can think of leadership as a spectrum, in terms of both visibility and the power the leader wields. On one end of the spectrum, we have the most visible, authoritative leaders like the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or a dictator such as Hitler or Gaddafi. At the opposite end of the spectrum is casual, low-key leadership found in countless situations every day around the world, leadership that can make a significant difference to the individuals whose lives are touched by it. Over the centuries, the first kind, the out in front, authoritative leadership has generally been exhibited by men. Some men in positions of great authority, including Nelson Mandela, have chosen a strategy of leading from behind. More often, however, top leaders have been quite visible in their exercise of power. So, we were founded just over 10 years ago, when I was in the Royal Academy, a museum in the center of London, with my 3 children, at the Aztec exhibition. I don't know if any of you saw it. I had an older child and 2 younger children, twins, strapped in a pushchair, and one of my children, 3 years old, shouted, and I've never denied he shouted, "Monster, monster." At this statue, which looked just like a monster, had snakes for hair, a big beak for a nose. And, I thought, this is fantastic. I've got a 3-year-old that's appreciating art. How good can it get? So, I bent down and I said, yes, it looks just like a monster. And, at that moment, a room warden came over, a gallery assistant came over and said we were being too noisy, and threw us out to the wrong family. I was, At that time, a journalist with the Guardian newspaper, and 2 days later wrote a big piece in the Guardian about being thrown out of the Royal Academy. What was really interesting was, by the end of that day, we had, at the paper, over 500 emails from other families saying, "Museums aren't working for us. Let's try and make it work." So, that's what we did. In The Guardian, we set up a campaign. We called it the Kids in Museums campaign.
I've been thinking a lot about the world recently and how it's changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years. 20 or 30 years ago, if a chicken caught a cold and sneezed and died in a remote village in East Asia, it would have been a tragedy for the chicken and its closest relatives. But I don't think there was much possibility of us fearing a global pandemic and the deaths of millions. 20 or 30 years ago, if a bank in North America lent too much money to some people who couldn't afford to pay it back and the bank went bust, that was bad for the lender and bad for the borrower, but we didn't imagine it would bring the global economic system to its knees for nearly a decade. This is globalization. This is the miracle that has enabled us to transship our bodies and our minds and our words and our pictures and our ideas and our teaching and our learning around the planet ever faster and ever cheaper. It's brought a lot of bad stuff, like the stuff that I just described, but it's also brought a lot of good stuff. A lot of us are not aware of the extraordinary successes of the Millennium Development Goals, several of which have achieved their targets long before the due date. That proves that the species of humanity is capable of achieving extraordinary progress if it really acts together and it really tries hard.
The impact on young Australians who are interested in buying a home of their own has been very significant. Australia's housing affordability now shapes the typical housing cycle or housing career as some people call it. Most Australians in the normal course of events are people who move through the housing cycle in a way that matches the stages of life that they're at. So, they move out of the family home in their late teens or early 20s as they gain their independence from their families, then they rent-save for a home they can afford as either a group, or maybe a couple. And maybe they can upgrade it when they have a family in their middle age. They are more than likely to have paid off their mortgage. And that means they have housing security in their old age. That's no longer the typical housing cycle for Australians. Young people generally live at home for much longer than they once did. They generally rent for longer and they're more likely to be saddled with a mortgage not just into their middle age but more often than not into their retirement as well. In fact, in 2006, 65,000 retiree households were still paying off the mortgage. Affordable rent is also an elusive right around Australia. We have very low rental vacancies. We see high turnover as landlords want to maximize their profits in tight market.
But Aristotle says the reason we need rhetoric is we have to be able to use it. To use rhetoric influence the ramble, we try to get them to understand truth. Truth is suggest, is different than 20 rhetoric is the dressing, is the body, right? Truth is the spirit, is the soul, is abstract. It doesn't have a body. It's not particular. If you want to get somebody to the truth, you might have to use some kind of tricks. Right? Because most of people are not sound and can see the truth. That's what we think. Most people are rambles. Really. Only the educated be erudite are actually capable of seeing the truth. If you want to get the general mass there, you may have to do a little bit. So Aristotle, that is rhetoric. Rhetoric is something that is used to influence people. Right? And it's a kind of mentally promised to logic. I think with our linguistic training we also get all this invisible training to be authorities, to be the people who know. It is part of that process that you come out as a world authority on your chosen subject. But when we move into working with communities, we have to recognize that the communities have to be the authority in their language. Actually, a woman in the class I'm teaching at Sydney at the moment, a career woman, expressed this very nicely. Although she was talking about something else, she was distinguishing expertise from authority. And certainly linguists, because of our training we do, have expertise in certain very narrow areas of language, but we don't have the authority over what to do with that knowledge or what to do with other knowledge that the community produces. I guess for me the bottom line is languages are lost because of the dominance of one people over another. That's not rocket science, it's not hard to work that out. But then what that means is if in working with language revival we continue to hold the authority, we actually haven't done anything towards undoing how languages are lost in the first place. So in a sense the languages are still lost if the authority is still lost. A PPT is given, and you can read it accordingly. This lecture compares the conditions on the Earth and Mars, as well as the habitability of Mars. There are some similarities such as polar caps, atmospheres and water climate. But Mars and the Earth also have lots of difference. Even the most inhabitable areas on the Earth are way different from those on Mars. In preparing for the Phoenix mission, scientists have done Antarctica trial runs. The lecture also describes different forms of water, hydrology, on the surface and underground of the Earth and Mars. Mars is not just smaller than Earth, it is also less dense. Though Mars is 15% of Earth's volume, it is only 11% of Earth's mass. This means that the pull of gravity on the surface of Mars is only 38% as strong as the pull of gravity on Earth's surface.